We have Dr. Neal Spencer and Dr. Carol Atack. Neal is the Deputy Director of the Fitzwilliam Museum, with a long heritage in working in some of our most eminent museums, including the British Museum, and with a special interest in Egyptology, but much wider research interests as well. Carol is a classicist, a fellow here at Newnham, and an expert in Greek political thought. They're going to talk about the issues that face our great national historical collections in the context of our contemporary world and the challenges that they face. The format's going to be a discussion, a dialogue between the two of them, and they're happy to take some questions at the end. So over to you, Neal and Carol.
Thank you and welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome Neal Spencer here, and it's also a great pleasure to have a discussion about the wonderful things in the Fitz and the wonderful plans for it too. I should declare an interest that I am also a syndic of the Fitz, which means that I sit on the university board that follows its activities and keeps an eye on what it's doing. Anyway, straight to business. As I think everybody in this room knows, the Fitzwilliam was founded as a result of a bequest in 1816 by the Earl of Fitzwilliam, pictured as a young man in a rather splendid portrait by Joseph Wright of Derby, which hangs in the museum to this day. And I put that on the slide because I think he looks like somebody who would be a really interesting student to teach.
I think it's actually his graduation portrait from 1764.
Yeah, because he didn't look quite like that as he got older.
No.
But one of the things I wanted to bet, the Fitz is a fascinating and complicated and multi-layered collection, and that's one of the things we're going to be delving into some of those layers today. The picture of the building you see is its public image as it appears on Wikipedia, a grand, formal, maybe a little forbidding neoclassical building built at vast expense, which finally opened to the public in 1848. I think a very interesting year for such a collection to open. But the collection itself is incredibly diverse, and so the other thing I put on this slide is Henri Fantin-Latour's White Cup and Saucer, which is a tiny little domestic picture that is a huge favourite with a lot of visitors. And I'm afraid I don't think you can see it at the moment, but when we reopen our splendidly restored galleries, you'll be able to see it. So I don't know if you anything you'd like to say about it? Yeah.
No, just that in terms of the range of the collection. So the collection that was bequeathed to the university that set up the museum in 1816 was Viscount Fitzwilliam's collection. Some of that had come from his grandfather, Matthew Decker, who was a Dutch-born British merchant. And there we come on to one of the problems or challenges with museums of this sort. So he was a director of the South Sea Company and then the East India Company, and obviously profited from the nature of trade in that period, and particularly relying on slave plantations. And he had a collection of something like 70 or 80 paintings, mostly Dutch or Flemish, that ended up in the collection. So, like many of these great museums, there's a complicated history entangled in colonial exploitation, essentially. So his bequest comprised old master paintings, around 40,000 prints, very unusually, most of them still remain in the albums that Fitzwilliam put them together in, so we can look at how he curated his collection. Musical manuscripts, drawings, and a number of other things. But there wasn't at this point, for instance, antiquities in the collection.
No, it's very interesting how the collection developed through subsequent bequests and also through acquisition policies by curators over the years. So we'll be looking at that as we go through. But as Neal has hinted, there's a big challenge facing historical collections in thinking about both how they should be relevant to audiences today, what they should be saying to audiences, what they should be hearing from audiences, who should be speaking, whose voices should we be hearing. And something that we've both been very struck by recently is an installation, not in fact at the Fitzwilliam, at Tate Britain, Hugh Locke's Procession, which is a wonderful installation in the Devine Gallery, another interesting point that contains, is it more than 150?
Yeah, so this is, it turns out that Carol and I were both here on Tuesday, unbeknownst to each other. So this is as you go into the Central Hall of Tate Britain, and it's an installation by a British artist, Hugh Locke, and there's around 150 figures that draw on Caribbean traditions of carnival and procession. And what's interesting was you come into this hall, this kind of neoclassical hall built, I think, in 1927. And there's no interpretation. You have to get to the end of the procession before you find out what any of this is. So it's quite shocking, striking, perplexing, and there's so many layers to this installation. So the quilting, the flags, the imagery, references to post-slavery share certificates, so the exploitation of Caribbean people, landscapes, resources through the 19th and into the early 20th century, references to environmental change, references to colonial architecture, and so on. And I think what struck both of us about this is that it's very relevant to our times, it's celebratory, but also thought-provoking, and it's relevant to this museum. So obviously Tate is founded on money accrued through the sugar business, indeed post-abolition, but still using exploitative methodologies and economies. And so as we go forward at the Fitzwilliam, I think it's important that while we remain relevant to today's concerns, we're also grounding that in the history of the institution. And I think what Tate have shown here is a really excellent example of that.
Yeah, but also something that is aesthetically thrilling and, as we said, enjoyable on multiple levels. So if you haven't been to see that, it's there, I think, for a year, and totally recommend that. But let's move on to some current displays in the Fitz and talk a little bit about those. One of the displays, the one on the right, is actually called Juxtaposition, and it's a kind of double-layered juxtaposition. Both the two figures, the two polychrome sculptures of suffering male bodies, that Saint Sebastian in a 1525 polychrome sculpture by Spanish artist Alonso Veragüeta, and much more recently a new acquisition for the museum, a figure by Reza Aramesh, Action 125, which depicts a young man undergoing torture and interrogation by Americans in the Gulf War. So those two sculptures are aesthetically juxtaposed with each other on one level, the horizontal and the vertical. They're also representing different approaches to art, yet similar tradition. They're also interacting in an interesting way with the Spanish gallery. So the painting you see from up on the right of St. Sebastian, his left is our El Greco.
And Murillo's on either side. And I think what's worth stressing here is the connections between these two sculptures. So the one at the back, the early 16th century one, is actually on loan to the museum, and it's something we'll pick up later in the discussion, that we have a long history of works coming into the collection on loan, and some of them end up part of the permanent collection. And it's a polychrome sculpture in limewood, and it's the same material that Reza Aramesh, who's an Iranian-born artist but trained in London, same material that he uses for the piece in the foreground. And interestingly, there's also connections in terms of production. So Reza Aramesh styles himself as a conceptual artist. He doesn't do the carving himself, so he worked with a carving workshop that also did the painting, the plastering, and the inlaying of the glass eyes on the figure on the foreground in the hills of northern Italy. And you might think, well, then is he really an artist? But of course, someone like Berruguete, he also had a large workshop, and it wouldn't have been his hands working on all these things. I think visitor responses to these has been very mixed. And I think we've had some people come in and feel shocked by the sculpture in the foreground. We've had others come in and say, is this the kind of thing that should be in a museum of fine art, in inverted commas? Is it even art? We've had other people say. And then other visitors have come in and said, I'm shocked. This has made me think of something. This has provoked thoughts, references to obviously war, torture, and so on. And I think as a university museum, that is something we're very keen to do. And so you could almost style these as, in the Spanish gallery, it's really a creative disruption. So instead of putting an exhibition in a box and people come to an exhibition and then leave and don't see your permanent collection, here they have to engage with the permanent collection, but also have other thoughts, other ideas brought into play. And I think as a university museum where we're surrounded by researchers, art historians, but also political historians, environmental scientists, and so on. I think this is the kind of thing we'll be doing more of in the future.
Yeah, and so we should move on to another current exhibition, Magdalene Arudundo's curation of her own work with work in the Fitz collection, which she enjoys. It's a celebration of 50 years since she came to Cambridge from Kenya as an art student and started to learn and develop skills in pottery while studying at what's now Anglia Ruskin. And to celebrate that anniversary, she curated a selection of items from museums across Cambridge, which are currently on display in one of our porcelain galleries. So the vessel on the right is Magdalene Arudundo's. That's been lent to us from a private collection. The one on the left is by Ladi Kwali, an African woman artist and potter who trained in the same school that Ardundo did. And I think that it's a very intriguing mixture. It's a very personal selection of sculpture, of ceramics, of objects, but also what's been really great is that we've heard Magdalene's own voice in the exhibition and in the signage. So perhaps you could say a bit about that.
I mean, I think what's fantastic about this is one of the real highlights of the or strengths of the Fitzwilliams collection is its ceramic collection. And this was not part of the bequest in 1816. This is something really built up from the late 19th, early 20th century onwards. We had two incredible bequests of literally thousands of ceramic vessels from two Cambridge graduates and indeed professors. And those were of British ceramics, 15th, 16th century onwards, but also of British studio pottery from the early 20th century, which was a really interesting period where these potters were very much inspired by the pottery traditions in West Africa, but also in Japan. So even our British collections tell a very global story in many ways. And our pottery collections also go through Germany with the Meissen porcelain, and incredible holdings also from China, Japan, and Korea. I'm just going to go on a little tangent here to say that seems like a very strange subset of the globe, and I think therein lies a story about 19th century hierarchies of art, visual culture, material culture. So the Fitzwilliam has generally been seen as the Fine Art Museum of Cambridge, and actually in the 1880s the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, which is just down the road, was set up, and that really entrenched a division between what was seen as fine art and what wasn't art. So, for example, paintings, prints, drawings, sculpture, ceramics from Europe came to the Fitzwilliam Museum. Also allowed in the door was Pharaonic Egypt, Persian and Indian miniatures, Persian ceramics, and material eventually from China, Japan, and Korea, particularly on the ceramics and jade and what was seen as fine art. Anything from sub-Saharan Africa, from the Americas, from the Pacific, went to the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. And so, I mean, it effectively could be described as a racist divide as to what was seen as fine art and what wasn't. And what's absolutely fantastic about the Magdalene Ardundo show, which is still on for a few more weeks, so do go and see it.
Middle of August, I think.
Middle of August, yeah. What's fantastic there is, as Carol pointed out, it's an East African artist who came to Cambridge to study at the School of Art, became disillusioned by fine art, fascinated by the pottery she saw both in the Fitzwilliam, so British and European pottery, but also pottery from Vanuatu in the Pacific, from Nigeria, from Moche, Peru, and so on, in the Archaeology and Anthropology Museum. And that led her, as an East African woman, to West Africa, where she trained with Ladi Kwali that Carol just mentioned. And so I think it really summarizes what a museum can do, opening up different ways of thinking, introducing you to different methodologies. And what we've done in the show is there's only 4 of her works on display, and she's picked the works from the collection that inspired her in the 1970s. I'm pleased to say that the pot in the foreground there was on loan from a private collection, but the private collector, having seen the display, has donated it permanently to the Fitzwilliam. So a nice example of how the collection can grow. But the other thing, when you go and see it, note that the labels and the panels, so the text, and they're also you can hear her voice through a kind of QR code link. It's all by her. It's all in the first person. So you're not getting that kind of institutional anonymous voice that you often see in museum displays. So do go. There's a few more weeks.
As Neal has said, that we're now going to go on a little. We're going to go have just a quick nod to Hockney's eye before we go on another journey to Africa. But again, this theme of juxtaposition, of thinking about the historic collection through modern art and responses to it, and understanding those dialogues. This is a corner of one of our grandest exhibition spaces, where most of our very traditional portraiture hangs, and it's been very nicely interrupted by works from throughout David Hockney's career that interrogate similar themes, but in a very different artistic language. And I should have taken the purple cloth up before I took the picture, because these are all images. The Hockney references Blake's Tiger poem, which is in the book in the case, and the stubs is a picture of tigers too, though I think they might be leopards actually.
Yeah, and that's Stubbs, who's of course famous for his horse paintings. Also painted a whole series of images of what were called tigers, spelled with a Y, but were known at the time already to be leopards. And he must have been painting those, having seen them in menageries in London that became very popular around Piccadilly in the late 1770s, 1780s. And he's placed them in this imaginary landscape, and it's difficult to know, are they in Africa somewhere? Are they in India? So again, it speaks to that whole encounter, entanglement, and exploitation of Britain's colonies.
And exoticization too, which is something we'll see. So now we're going to go on a trip to Egypt. As you learned at the beginning, Neal is an archaeologist of the Nile Valley with expertise in the early cultures of what are now Egypt and Sudan. The Fitz has a very intriguing collection of pharaonic antiquities, again, not part of the founder's bequest, but which came to us later. There's been a history of doing, because people, I think they're some of the most loved, the mummies are some of the most loved objects in the museum. Various bits and pieces have been on tour to local communities, which is another way in which the museum sort of expanded outside its own walls and tried to engage with wider communities, because, as I say, that sense we started with of the museum building being a bit foreboding and not the most welcoming of spaces to casual visitors, this has been something that has brought people into an engagement with the collection. But under Neal's watch, there's the opportunity for much further engagement with those cultures.
Shall I say a few words about the coffin? The coffin set that you can see on the left dates to around 900 BC of a man named Nesparweh Shefit. These long Egyptian names. And this was actually one of the first Egyptian antiquities to come to Cambridge. So it arrived in Cambridge in 1822. Two Trinity graduates actually travelled with, and here's another colonial entanglement, they travelled with the armies of the Albanian ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, as he went to conquer Sudan. And there was a lot of foreigners that went on those trips, including scholars. He published his journeys, which Sudan at that time is often referred to as Ethiopia. And he must have passed through what is modern Luxor today and brought this, they must have passed through modern Luxor and brought this set back. But this is an example of part of our collection that's being looked at in a very different way now. So one of the strengths within Cambridge is what we call heritage science or technical art history. So it's using the power of the university scientists to look at cultural heritage in new ways. So our conservators, our curators at the Fitzwilliam Museum have been working really over the last 10 years, looking at the details of how these coffins were constructed, so using X-rays and other imaging techniques, CT scans and so on, but also how they've been reused over time, the methodology of painting, what materials were used and so on. And so I think it opens up so many avenues and ways into the research. And the picture that Carol has put on the top there is a little pop-up that our curator Helen Strudwick and colleagues did a few years ago. And these were done in both Egypt and in places around East Anglia, in places like Wisbech and so on.
That is Wisbech, yeah.
That's in Wisbech, and also in pubs and so on.
Yeah.
And what's fantastic about it is, for instance, the knowledge that you gain from talking to people who are not academic experts. So, for instance, as Egyptologists, talking to modern-day carpenters who work with wood every day, and how you get a different understanding of what it must have been like, even if they don't understand ancient Egyptian objects, to work wood, to work with the material. Also working with, for instance, stone sculptors and so on. So a big part of our Egypt programming now is around that work with communities in East Anglia, but also communities in particular in northern Egypt.
So yeah, and you have more to say about Egypt.
I do. I won't go on for too long,
we need to keep moving, I think.
But just to say briefly, one of the things we're looking to do in the next couple of years is to redisplay our Egyptian galleries. And so the displays, as they are at the moment, have a chronological section, and then they have areas that address kind of funerary beliefs and so on. Like many Egypt displays in museums, those displays end in Roman Egypt with a few pieces from later eras. And I think there's an opportunity as we redisplay them to think about what we can do in a university museum. So what I've shown here on the left is our famous sarcophagus lid of Ramses II, brought back by Giovanni Belzoni in around 1822. But in the middle is one of what I would call the treasures of Cambridge University. So lurking away in the basement of the Cambridge University Library is something like 300,000 manuscripts that were taken from a storeroom in a synagogue in Cairo in the late 19th century. And these provide incredible insights into day-to-day life in Egypt from the 9th century to the 17th century AD. And what's fantastic about this era is in Cairo at that time, you had Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities. And so this is just one example of those 300,000 manuscripts. And on it, it's a petition from a Muslim silk weaver to the owner of a silk weaving workshop, asking if he can be let go and pay his debts to the workshop back over time. But what's really interesting is he describes how in the workshop there were Muslim and Jewish craftsmen working together. And so it really upends the divisions that are often imposed on these medieval societies because of scholarship being done in different boxes through different languages or through archaeology, through art history and so on. And so is there an opportunity as we redisplay Egypt at the Fitzwilliam to think about Egypt after the ancient period and think of the layered past of that country? And so the image on the right is from the 1920s, and I think we just need to think about how Egyptians have looked at their past and how they've leveraged it in the 20th century. Yeah. Again, as a university museum, querying it in different ways, while remaining something that we want school children to come to and enjoy.
Yeah, and I think you wanted to say something more about the kinds of collaborations that
Yeah, and so as we redevelop those galleries, what we really want to do is bring Egyptian voices into co-curating those galleries with us. So Helen, the curator I mentioned earlier, has got funding from the university at the moment to bring a series of Egyptian curators and heritage specialists over to Cambridge this summer to help with us on working up the narratives of those galleries. And what's really important here is to do that early on. There's been a long, recent history of museums, putting together a plan and then going and talking to some communities and saying, do you like this? But it's a bit late. It's conceived, it's designed already. And so we want to do it very early on in the process. So these are just some images of some work I've done with schools in Egypt and with anthropologists and students in Sudan, and just the different kind of perspectives you get through people who've lived in these landscapes and in these environments. And working in the same disciplines as us, but from those different perspectives. And I think that's something we're going to be wanting to do across our collections more as we redisplay things. Is whose voices should be appearing in the museum.
So one of your key role is to direct that research and maybe to bring those voices in and to widen the conversations that are taking place. So tell me, you wanted to talk a bit about.
Yeah, so I mean,
this.
the Fitzwilliam Museum has always been part of the university. It was,
Yeah.
it was a bequest to the university by Richard Fitzwilliam that we heard about earlier. But I think often, while there's been very strong links between individuals, individual curators, directors, other learning staff, and so on, with other departments, and particularly, as you might imagine, with the Department of History of Art, the Department of Classics, the Department of Archaeology that includes, for instance, Egyptology, very strong links, but increasingly we're wanting to work with other departments on aspects of our research. And so I'm going to give you just a little flavour of that. One of our kind of, I think, great unheralded parts of the collection is what you might call our Islamic art. Some of this was already coming into the museum in the 19th century. There is a gallery, broadly speaking, dedicated to particularly the ceramic arts of Persia, Turkey, and to a certain extent Islamic Egypt. We've never had a dedicated curator of that area. We've done a number of displays and small exhibitions, but there's lots more to be done in this space. And so just to give you two snapshots of what's going on at the moment, many of you might know the Alhambra, the beautiful palace pictured on the top right that's in Granada in southern Spain. This was the palace of the last Muslim rulers, often called Moorish rulers, of Iberia. What we have in the Fitzwilliam, lurking again in a storeroom, these have never been on display to my knowledge, are plaster casts of the decoration of the Alhambra. Now you might think, why is this interesting when the monument is still standing? Well, these are very, very early. These date to 1830s. The 1830s. And what's interesting is that this is at a period some 30, 40 years before the Spanish government started restoring the Alhambra and really kind of turning it into, I think saying Orientalist theme park would be a bit strong, but kind of setting it in stone in a certain period and erasing some of the layers of architectural style that existed before. So they're very important records. There's others in the V&A from slightly later of what this monument looked like. And so we're doing a project at the moment. Flavia Ravioli is one of our conservators. She's leading a research project with colleagues in the Department of History of Art, but also working with colleagues in the history of the reception of Islamic art. And I should say this is 1830, so it's before those books by Owen Jones and so on that were so influential in terms of bringing Islamic, so-called Islamic art styles into the kind of the visual language of Britain. What we're looking at is in particular the technique that was used to make these plaster casts that seems to be based on a 14th century technique that was used by the Nasrid craftsmen to build the Alhambra, which was initially carved directly in gypsum on the monument, and then they moved towards casting with wooden and clay molds, and it seems that these 1830s casts are copying that. So we've just embarked on that project, and a second project, if we can move to the next slide, please, is around another area of our Islamic collections. And so this is moving to Persia. So we've moved to we might call the Islamic East. And one of the, again, highlights of the collection, and some of this is on display, is this material from a site in northeastern Iran near the Caspian Sea, where a hoard of beautiful tin-glazed ceramics were found. Many of these are on display, date from the 9th to the 12th century AD, but very little is known about this technique. What we're doing is we're partnering with the archaeology department to do imaging and analysis of the material and the technology, the firing temperature, and so on. But we're also, and this is really exciting, we're bringing this, the guy I've pictured here, Abbas Akbari. He is both a practicing artist in reconstructing tin-glazed earthenware, but he's also a lecturer in Tehran University in archaeological science. And so he's coming in December for 2 weeks to spend time in the Fitzwilliam Museum to do some experimental workshops, some filmmaking around this. The image on the bottom right is a bit murky, is him actually grinding up some of the iron oxide which would be used in the glazing. So again, that idea of getting perspectives from people who have lived experience of working with these materials and production techniques, and an example of how we want to bring in voices from elsewhere, from outside Cambridge, into our collection.
Yeah, no, That is fascinating. And one of the things I was thinking about with the Alhambra casts is the fact that across the road from here, there's the Museum of Classical Archaeology, which is at its core a set of grand tour plaster casts of classical sculptures that were originally at one point in their history part of the Fitzwilliams collection, but rather than being kept in a basement, they were hived off first to the original display space that's now part of Peterhouse, and then when the new classics faculty was built in the late 70s, early 80s, part of that. So the problem of dealing with art that's perceived of being a copy seems to be cross-cultural, but to have been handled differentially by culture. So I think that's a kind of intriguing sidelight. Another point I wanted us to talk about a bit was research into the fine art collection of the museum. This is Simeon Solomon's 1859 drawing of Fanny Eaton, a London woman of Jamaican origin who sat for many of the pre-Raphaelites as a model and was very much exoticized and othered and represents quite a wide range of ethnicities in the works of various artists. But for a long time, this portrait was not known, that the identity of the sitter was unknown. Feminist art historians did that work. One of the people involved in that who displayed this drawing at the National Portrait Gallery 2 or 3 years ago now, Jan Marsh, has done a lot of work in finding the identities of sitters, of people, particularly of Black people, used as models, but not necessarily documented in the way that some models were. And this picture, which I think everybody will agree is aesthetically quite stunning, has brought about a range of responses from visitors to the museum, and I mean, certainly is one of our treasures, but I think we've almost gone overboard in some aspects of our response to that. But I think you were going to read a little bit by Jackie Kay's poem.
So one of the things we did a few years ago is in displaying this, we also and not just this work actually, we sought a series of creative responses to our collection, which went up in the format of podcasts that can be looked up on our website. And one of the things we did was we invited in Jackie Kay, who is effectively the Scottish Poet Laureate, and she did a creative, poetic response to this about imagining rediscovering it. And I think I'm just going to read a couple of lines from the poem. This is a work in pencil. Obviously, many of her depictions are in oil paintings of famous pre-Raphaelite painters. So, reading from Jackie's poem, she says, "Here in the graphite, you are the most yourself, not the needlewoman, not in turquoise beads, but unadorned and yet more beautiful. The authentic self in pencil, not oil. You gaze down through time, as if you could imagine it all, as if you knew the years we'd travel, and the years you might have lost." It's a much longer poem, have a look on our website, but I think what's become increasingly apparent to us is that this is also a very problematic image. And so in looking at the Fitzwilliams collection, because of the history of the collectors involved and so on, I think it's fair to say that it's an overwhelmingly white collection. It's an overwhelmingly straight collection, and some have described it as a somewhat conservative collection. And of course, there are outliers in that. And I think given the context we're all in and really wanting to become more relevant for our audiences, and I think it's worth at this point really stressing something that didn't actually occur to me until I came. I mean, I've been away from Cambridge for 20 years, and coming back to the Fitzwilliam, in my first week here, it was pointed out to me that Cambridge, both the city and the region, are amongst the most unequal in the UK, and so that's in terms of access to social, economic, cultural opportunities. There's a lot of poverty in all those senses, and it's also a much more diverse community than it was when the Fitzwilliam was set up. And so we've been very consciously thinking about how do we collect works that are more relevant for our audiences. And I think, while showing this Fanny Eaton is in a way allowing us to show black sitters in paintings. They're not without their problems. This is the white male gaze, and so we need to think about that. And the other thing about Fanny Eaton is, if I remember rightly, there's absolutely no record of any of her thoughts or her motivations during her time in England. So there's still an anonymity to this work. And what we'll come on to later is how we're trying to address some of those issues.
Yeah, so maybe we'll move on to the next big. I mean, it's also it's one of those things that seems incredibly paradoxical, because this is one of the great collections in the UK. I mean, its extent is.
It's about 500,000 objects.
It's quite mind-blowing. I mean, you mentioned the print collection. I spent a day in the print room looking at some of its highlights with the print curator recently, and it was just absolutely treasure after treasure after treasure, but all kinds of problems. How do we display things that are in bound volumes? How can we make these things accessible when they're in such fragile condition? How can we document these better? How can we make them more accessible? And yet it's really important that the collection is expanded and perhaps rebalanced. So perhaps you could say a little bit about the kind of thinking behind that.
Yeah, so it's a good time to talk about this, actually, because just last year with our syndicate, of which Carol is a member, we had approved a new collections development strategy. So collections development is effectively kind of museum terminology for basically acquisitions. It can include deaccessions, but that's very rare. So how do you develop the collection? And often a collection such as the Fitzwilliam will be renowned for its historic material, but you've got to remember that throughout its 200-year history, it has been buying things that are of the moment. And of course, we need to continue to do that. Limitations are financial, obviously, but particularly also physical and in terms of conservation. So, for instance, we are not going to acquire a 30-foot high artwork. We've got nowhere to put it. We might put it on temporary display, but we can't house it in the future. We don't acquire photographs. We don't have the right conservation or storage conditions for photography. We don't acquire, for instance, time-based media such as performance or film for the same reasons. And so what we've been trying to do, or really are starting on a journey, building on some of our recent acquisitions over the last decade or so, is starting to think, how can we approach those questions of creating a collection that's more relevant for our audiences, more reflective of the diversity of our audiences and our desired audiences, but also still in the spirit of the Fitzwilliam. And so Carol opened the talk talking about the cup and saucer painting, and it's small, it's a jewel-like thing, and that characterizes much of our collection. I talked about ceramics earlier and how rich our ceramics collection are. So thinking about those media, those techniques that we have richness, historic richness in, but starting to pivot to look at them in a different way. And I'm just going to show you one example of something we've acquired in the last few months. It's not on display yet, but we will be putting it on display in due course. So this is a group of 18 bone china plates, which at a distance might sound very Fitzwilliam. Lots of bone china in the collection.
We do rather a lot, don't we?
They could slot quite nicely into that porcelain gallery we were talking about. But actually, looking at them closer, you realise they're very different. If we could have the next slide. So these are a group of 18 plates. They're conceived as one artwork called History at the Dinner Table, and they're by a Jamaican artist called Jacqueline Bishop, who's pictured in her studio on the left. She lives between New York and actually Leeds, where she's doing a PhD at the moment. And so she grew up in Jamaica, and in her grandmother's house, there was always these, mahogany wall presses with bone china in them, plates and so on. And she realised that while these were both beautiful, and she described them as calming, they also, were redolent of a certain kind of exoticizing. Many of them showed what were the colonies, and so she riffing on that or drawing on that. What she's done is create these beautiful bone china plates. One of them is illustrated on the right, so gilded on the outside, botanical designs on them. But there you can see she's also drawn from illustrations that are shocking today of in this case a bound black woman. And so something that's beautiful but disturbing and thought-provoking allows us to explore, for instance, the legacies of colonization and the relationship of the visual to that, how that was propagated through the visual, and that played out in different ways. So both in terms of disturbing imagery, but also the abolitionist movement then used imagery as part of its campaign. So these are important things for us to reflect. So this is an example of acquiring something new for the collection that is in the spirit of the collection, but also disrupts it in many ways. So hopefully you'll be able to see this in the coming period when we get it on display.
We were going to talk a bit about the breadth of collections in Cambridge and where the Fitz sits within that.
Yes, so I mentioned the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology earlier, but we're very fortunate in Cambridge that we have a range of collections that are really unparalleled anywhere else. So there's 8 museums in Cambridge. There's also, which range from the Geology Museum through to the Zoology Museum, History of Science. We've got the Fitzwilliam, the Archaeology and Anthropology, the Polar Museum, and so on. We also have collections everywhere else. Every department has collections. And I'm not even talking about colleges here. I'm talking about the university. So there's also collections in the university library, manuscripts. The Botanic Gardens has living plant collections, also samples. And so what I think what the university has never really got a handle on is that those are not nice to haves, and sometimes awkward nice to haves with difficult histories that we've been talking about, but actually how could they be used by researchers across the university? And so we've just started an initiative across the whole university earlier this year called Collections, Connections, Communities. And what we're trying to do there is convene researchers across the university, so not just Egyptologists working on ancient Egypt stuff or art historians working on the Impressionists, but actually what about when we talk with the psychology department about how one responds to art, or work with the Cambridge Public Health Centre to think about how people's well-being improves in engaging with collections, or working with the Policy Research Institute on how we might advocate for policy change relating to collections. So we're just embarking on this journey, but what we really want to do is involve our communities in our research. So obviously being in a university museum, research is at the heart of what we do, and we've heard about that already. But we also want that research not to be exclusionary. So how do you bring in non-academic expertise and put it next to, so not fighting against, but complementing academic expertise? We heard about the carpenters earlier. That's one example. And so I thought we've seen some quite, I suppose, new and disruptive and exciting things, but I thought we could show how even something very traditional can be done in a new way. One of the ways we want to involve people in our research is embodied by this project, Inspire Nature. Some of you may have seen the True to Nature exhibition that's on at the Fitzwilliam now until the end of August. But in parallel, our learning team did a project bringing together digitally collections from across Cambridge to provide teachers with tools to teach around the environment. And I'm just going to mention this briefly. You can have a look on the website of this, just Google Inspire Nature. But what's been absolutely fantastic about this is the evaluation has shown how it's increased the confidence of primary school teachers in teaching the environment. And that's the kind of impact we hope to have, that's very much on the ground, helping communities, in this case, schools.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the True to Nature exhibition itself is a really exemplary Fitz exhibition in a way. It's an exhibition that was organised in partnership with other institutions. So I saw its first instantiation at the National Gallery in Washington in February 2020 when I was on a research fellowship there. And it was a very conventional painting show. Beautiful paintings, the same ones that we're showing, but just a gallery full of paintings. And the way in which the Fitz curators have, in their terms, fitzed it up, has been to bring in material from the other museums so that you can see these see these pictures, these sketches, oil sketches painted from nature. Some of them maybe worked up in the studio afterwards, in conjunction with the kinds of geological specimens that were being gathered at the same time, and to see how art was responding to scientific research and to cultural debates and discussions. And if you haven't been to see True to Nature, I think it's a very, very good example of what the Fitz does really, really well when its starting point is traditional fine art, and how it can go beyond that, and you can learn something about how people got to think about things, how cloud formations got their names, how many different kinds of lava there are, just how beautiful some of the material from the Geology Museum is sitting alongside paintings. But yes, we're going to look at an even more traditional thing.
So John Constable is one of those names that pops up in all the kind of discussions of the
there are sketches
artist.
by him in that exhibition.
There are, and of course he's known for his very big, what we call 6-footer paintings that were shown in the Royal Academy and so on. But he also did watercolors, smaller sketches, his sketchbooks and so on. But what I'd like to just mention here is a project that we're getting underway at the Fitz on a particular set of work that he did. So in around 1829. I think Constable had a fairly frustrated career, looking for recognition and also making a living and so on. In around 1829, he decided he needed to turn part of his energies towards producing prints, and so Constable got in touch with a very young printmaker named David Lucas. And they embarked on a project called English Landscapes, where he picked 32 scenes. Most of them are in what we know as Constable country, in Suffolk and Essex. There's the odd one in Hampstead Heath and so on, and picked those and decided to have them worked up with David Lucas into mezzotint prints. And then he would have commentary next to each of them. This was a project that remained unfinished. And what's absolutely fantastic in the Fitzwilliam is we have the biggest collection anywhere in the world of not just the set of prints, but the proofs and the impressions, the different states of the prints. Because what was happening is Lucas would create the copper printing plate. He would create impressions. He'd send them to Constable, and Constable would mark them up, ask for corrections. And the other thing that's fantastic is in the Fitz, we also have the letters between the two of them, where they're corresponding about what needs to be changed, the approach, and so on. And Constable gets quite grumpy at times in these letters, and so the changes that are happening, and remember these changes then need to be wrought on the copper plate. So this is an example of one very typical landscape with the windmill and the cloud formations over the top, the oxen ploughing and so on, and the notes that you get on them in the letters are interesting. So just to give you an example of the kind of tone, he says, "Can you clear the sun a bit more around its orb?" Or make the shower a little darker here and there. And some of them are quite poetic, such as, "I want the rays of light to be crushed." And what we've been doing, again, supported by the kind of imaging facility, the heritage science facilities we have in Cambridge here, which is possible through a big grant from the government's Arts and Humanities Research Council to create a Cambridge Heritage Science Hub, which is called Cherish. And the imaging techniques in there, including a method called reflective transformative imaging, which I can't explain to you, but allows you to use raking light in different ways and move it around on a computer. So you could do it on our website without actually seeing the print. What our curator, Eleanor Ling, and our paper conservator, Harry Metcalfe, have been able to do is identify new changes to the prints and actually work out the order in which the artists, Constable and Lucas, were constructing this series, and so it shows that combination of heritage science and close looking by conservators and curators, how it can reveal new insights into what has been around for 200 years and we all think we're familiar with. But we're in Cambridge, so what else can we do differently? So if I could have the next slide, we're just starting a project next week, actually, called Walking with Constable. And so what you can see here is a Google Earth image with a walk plotted, which my colleagues are going to be doing next week. So Eleanor Ling, our curator of prints, is going to be going on a walk with other Cambridge specialists, so environmental scientists, landscape specialists, people from the library who know about the history of the kind of parish records and so on. And then, thinking about that non-academic expertise, they're going to be doing it with walking groups who know that landscape inside out, and thinking, what does it mean to walk through Constable country 200 years later? What are our responses to the environment? How has that environment changed? And so again, part of that kind of participatory approach to research. So I think an exciting example of how the traditional can be looked at in new ways.
Okay, and we're going to close with another example of a new view on a traditional image.
Yeah, I thought
Perhaps
this was...
you could say a bit about
Yeah.
well, both things here.
I thought this is a nice way to end. So on the left, along with the True to Nature exhibition that's on at the moment, that Carol was just talking about, we've committed to rewilding our lawn, and it's looking absolutely amazing at the moment. There's this kind of carpet of wildflowers. They're blue and white in that, kind of purplish and white in that picture I took. They're now all yellow and red yesterday. And we've committed to leaving that rewilded for the future. And then on the right, one of our most recent acquisitions, and again, I think this kind of sums up much of what we've been talking about. So this is by a Birmingham artist called Barbara Walker. And it's called Vanishing Point. And so it's actually a combination of a graphite drawing with embossing of the paper. It's big. It's about so big. And what she does is she takes 17th and 18th century Dutch and British paintings, in this case a Dutch painting by an artist called Doyster. And what she does is she copies the painting, but she only represents in graphite or in pencil the black individual in the paintings, and then she embosses the rest to push into the background the people who are in the foreground in the original painting. And so thinking about that diversity, how we represent different viewpoints and represent the underrepresented, this is a black British artist bringing back to the forefront the individuals that have been in the background of our art histories, to be honest. So yeah, this is acquired in the last few weeks.
Yeah, so where are you going to display it, Neil?
So this is the thing, when a museum acquires something, there's a whole process that goes into training. As you know, there's various committees that have to approve it. It then needs to come, it might need to be remounted. Then you have to think of light levels, where it goes. And then sometimes you take a strategic choice not to put it out immediately because you might want to put it into an exhibition where it will have a much higher profile. So at the moment, we're still working out exactly how we most impactfully put these new works on display. More to follow.
Okay, well, I think that's an invitation to everybody to keep visiting the Fitzwilliam and to see its collection developing and change and see the fruits of the extraordinary research that people from across the university and wider communities are contributing to. So I think this is a great moment in the long history of the institution, a very exciting inflection point, perhaps. But as we've been talking about hearing multiple voices, so I think we've got time for a few questions.
What was the museum, or where is the museum where you did the carnival?
Oh, Tate Britain in London.
Oh, it's in London.
Yeah. So that, in London, close to the riverbank, just west of Westminster. But yeah, do go and see it. It's awesome.
Neil, I was going to say, if you've got a torn down statue, what do you do about that? Do you hide it away, or do you bring it out with context? What's your thought on that?
That's a political hot potato at the moment, what you do. And everyone will probably be familiar with the example of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol that ended up in the harbour and has now been redisplayed on its side, still with the graffiti on it, in one of the museums in Bristol. And it's a live debate in Cambridge. There's a number of monuments throughout the city and some of the colleges that have these histories related to enslavement and so on. So in the Fitzwilliam, we haven't had any particular examples where we've done anything. We've had a few examples where we've realized our labels. I mean, we've thousands of objects on display, and we've often had visitors come in and say, well, this label is a bit problematic, and then we review it. Our view is not to remove things from display, but rather to contextualize them, to problematize them, to disrupt them. And sometimes that might be putting another artwork in dialogue with them. Sometimes it might be through the label or through other means. We also have to be wary, though, that there will be images that might be traumatic in some ways, and so might not be appropriate to show. And so that's a difficult discussion. So I don't think there's any easy answer. It depends on the particular context and also the particular moment you're in. So, what we would do now might be very different to just 3 years ago because of everything that's happened in the few years.
So you mentioned how in that new pottery exhibition you had the change in labels written from the first person, from the artists themselves. And obviously that's great for modern work you're exhibiting, but is there any future for the older pieces and were you changing the labels in sort of the future of heritage?
I could talk about labels for a long time,
Yes,
but I'll keep it brief.
Mm-hmm.
So what's often called interpretation in museums, largely it's labels, panels, but it can extend to digital things and video and also website and so on. We've just started an interpretation project where we're going to review our approach to interpretation. We're starting by having internal discussions in the museum, and crucially, not just with curators, but across the whole museum. And you wouldn't believe the fountain of knowledge that are our front of house staff who see how visitors interact with the collection on a daily basis. And so one of the big questions has been around voices. As you mentioned, Magdalene Ardundo and her voice in the first person. Most of our labels are in a fairly classic anonymous institutional voice. And I should say there's also quite a disconnect between, say, how we display our paintings upstairs. Many of those galleries don't have an introductory panel. You're almost expected to understand who the hero artists are, what the biblical narratives are, what classical mythology is represented. You go downstairs to the Egypt galleries, and it's more like a kind of archaeology textbook on the wall. What's that disconnect about? So thinking about voices with earlier material, I mean, it depends what that material is, but for instance, with some of the say Italian Renaissance artists, there's vast amounts of material, sometimes in their own voices, those who are in their workshops, those who are buying their works or commissioning their works, and so on. So can we bring those into the discussion? And actually, if you go to see our True to Nature exhibition, there's very large quotes on the wall from some of those artists. So that's one way of bringing in voices. Sometimes
and also from a range of different voices, from scientists, from school children, different people responding to the work, so bringing some contemporary voices into the discussion of historical art.
And one of the challenges, of course, is say when you go into older times or more kind of what you might call demotic works, so kind of the day-to-day pottery, we don't necessarily know who's made them. So you might not have that close connection between artist and voice, but what voices from that era can you bring into play? It's a very kind of live discussion. The other thing I think is that we need to think, what does that institutional voice do, and should there actually be, should you get a sense of curators and other colleagues' perspectives? Should they be named? Why are they anonymous? These are all things we're thinking about.
Do you have any items in the collection that are being at the moment claimed for return to the place, country of origin?
So it's actually a very pertinent question. We have a claim at the moment from a legal firm relating to a painting in the collection with evidence that it may have been seized from an apartment in Paris by Nazi agents in 1941. This is a painting that came into the collection in 1951, donated by a Trinity graduate who donated collections to Tate and elsewhere, Eric Milner-White, and we didn't know anything about the evidence of where it had been since painted in the 1870s up until 1951. And so the way that works is there's a government spoliation advisory panel. So they look at all the information, and that's what they're doing at the moment, and they make a recommendation as to what. Now, as we're not a national museum, it will be up to the university to decide what to do following that recommendation. So that's an example at the moment, but we don't have any live restitution claims from, for example, countries of origin, for example, Egypt. Yeah, nothing at the moment.
Time for one more.
I was quite impressed by the two sculptures of suffering. The one that's kind of very colourful and the one that's kind of bleached. When it comes to the ancient statues downstairs, is there going to be a similar thing? Because of course a lot of those statues would have had colour at the time, but have been bleached over time. Is there any idea to kind of have a best guess at what some of these objects would look like at the time? Yeah, so looking at colour on ancient sculpture is an area of great amounts of research at the moment. I don't mean in Cambridge, but more broadly. There very much has been a kind of aesthetic since earlier in the 19th century around the kind of white classical statue. Obviously now with scientific techniques, you can often reconstruct the colour. One of the challenges is it's very difficult to reconstruct tone and shadow and so on. So we've often seen depictions that we don't know how reliable they are. If you go to the Museum of Classical Archaeology that Carol talked about earlier, there is actually one that's been repainted to give some idea. We have done some work on some of our classical and Egyptian sculpture to look at the remnants of pigment, but how you do that, whether you do it in the flesh or you do it digitally, is a source of some debate, but lots of research potential in that area.
One quick last question.
On a similar thread to what the lady down there was saying about sort of reclaiming objects, I was thinking, do you think museums like the Fitzwilliam have more of a scope to be revolutionary, to have forward-thinking ideas, that if they're not like the capital libraries, like the British Museum with the Parthenon marbles and things, do you think they've got more scope to try out more sort of experimental ideas that the capital might follow later with sort of national museums?
I think the fact we're in a university museum with that whole kind of curiosity, that demand for research and rigorous research, I think means we should be able to do things like that. But of course, there are challenges. So putting on an exhibition is something that takes years of planning and careful work. So how and I think this is a challenge for us. How do we balance that so we can do something that might be a bit more pop-up or prototypey or risk-taking? And it's something we very much want to look at.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Neal and Carol. That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you for giving us such great insights, both into all the research that's going on behind the scenes in the Fitzwilliam and, of course, how you're evolving to meet some of the challenges you've talked about. Thank you very much indeed for a great afternoon.